Hello and welcome to the Climate Crisis Advisory Group's final public broadcast of the year. My name is Ade Adepitan and it's great to be your host. Since our last broadcast, 197 countries and over 85,000 participants convened in Dubai for this year's annual climate summit, COP28. For the first time in history, almost every country in the world has agreed to transition away from fossil fuels. An unprecedented historic commitment. Alongside this, we saw the creation of a fund for loss and damage, and 134 countries signed a declaration to tackle the climate impacts of the food industry. These will be important steps forward if they translate to immediate, meaningful action, which by no means is certain. Now, COP28 was marred from the outset by allegations that host UAE intended to leverage the summit to forge future deals for oil and gas, and commitments regarding fossil fuels were watered down considerably in the final text. Yet, the science is indisputable. Our current rate of progress falls far short of the scale and pace required to tackle the climate crisis. We cannot ensure that the planet remains or returns below the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate limit if we stop short of anything less than a total phase out of fossil fuels. Above 1.5 degrees Celsius, the world enters a danger zone of unacceptable risk and uncertainty that invites the worst climate impacts. This is not a scenario that will happen in the distant future. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has remarked, we are already living through climate collapse in real time, and the impact is devastating. So it's against this backdrop that today we reflect on the achievements and the compromises of COP28 and what must be achieved in the next few years which will be critical for humanity. So with this in mind, I welcome today's guests alongside CCAG's panel of experts. Tom Evans, Policy Advisor for the Climate Diplomacy Team at Climate Change Think Tank E3G. Dr. Jennifer Allan, Senior Lecturer at Cardiff University's School of Law and Politics and expert in environmental and social movements. Ade Adepitan, climate activist and host of the Climate Talks podcast. You are all very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I'd like to start with a reflection from our CCAG members on COP28. So, Professor Johan Rockström, you noted that the language around fossil fuels is too vague and removal of CO2 is nowhere to be found in the final text. What are your thoughts on what was achieved?
Yeah, thanks, Ade, and good to be with you. So our conclusion here at the Potsdam Institute is that what we have now on the table will not enable us to hold 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, but it's a workable plan. It is a milestone. Finally, we have all the oil, gas, and coal nations in the world accepting that we have a crisis, accepting that fossil fuels are causing it, and agreeing that we now need to transition away from all fossil fuels in this critical decade in line with science, quoting explicitly the statement 28D in the agreement. So that is, of course, a major step forward, but it's insufficient. And why is it insufficient? Well, for two reasons. Well, there are several reasons, but two that I'd like to emphasize. I mean, number one, just as you pointed out, Ade, we've spent too much time on fighting over whether it's phase out or phase down. I would argue that that is just a semantic, almost academic fight. What we need is a plan, and that plan has to be not only scientifically aligned, but it has to be quantitative. It needed to say, bend the curve of emissions within the next 2 years, cut emissions by half by 2030, and continue cutting emissions by half to a net zero world economy by 2050. Do that for all fossil fuels and particularly phase out coal. That is not fully there, but I just want to recognize that the Dubai statement actually states explicitly under paragraph 27 that emissions need to be reduced by 43% by 2030 and 60% by 2035. That's not too bad if one holds on to those numbers. That's IPCC quoted numbers. And it's also clear from the statement overall that it does make really emphasizing really in an explicit way the urgency of this decade. So that's why I land in the conclusion that we can work with this document. So the dilemma is not really this document. The dilemma is how will it be perceived? How will it be received in oil and gas nations in particular, but also in the financial institutions in the world? So I think we have a large responsibility to now carry this document and not allow the loopholes to be used. You may have seen the references to UAE just days after the COP meeting announcing new investments in oil and gas, same in Norway. And this, of course, is violating the Dubai agreement. And that has to be, I think, the task now to put this document to work.
Thank you, Professor Rockström. We need a plan. I think it's such an important and great point to be taken into account. And I want to hear from Dr. Arunabha Ghosh to hear your perspective on the final text and kind of the importance and relevance of COP28, because so many people are watching. So many people are watching the world leaders and watching the outcomes of COP28. And I think it sets the tone for where the public are and where our world leaders are. So, Arunabha, what are your thoughts on what happened at COP28?
Thank you, Ade, and it's good to be back at a CCAG briefing after several months when I could not attend for my due to my other engagements. I'm afraid my reading and analysis of COP28 is perhaps a little less. I'm not saying Johan gave a positive view. I think he gave a very realistic view of what we need to do, and we need to have a plan. But my own reading is a little more negative than that. As I mentioned in another briefing just a couple of days ago, for me, COP28 passed the English exam on drafting the text, barely scraped through the climate science exam, and completely and utterly failed in the assignments on accounts for accounting for actions taken and not taken, and on the assignment for maths in adding up climate finance. So if one were sitting their high school exam, just passing the English test and barely scraping through science is not a high school passing grade. To me, this illustrates the challenge we have with the way we've ended up with COPs overall, where there is so much hand-wringing about the actual phraseology and the text that we forget that there is science underlying it. But there we also forget that in order to operationalize the science, we also have to ask what is the kind of science we are paying attention to. We also have to then, if we have to follow the science, we have to follow also the issue of carbon space. We have to ask ourselves, why is it that developed countries are off track by 38% in terms of what they've promised for this decade and what their actions are going to amount to, let alone the fact that their promises are way below the 43% reduction that Johan referred to. We have to ask ourselves what happened to the 3.7 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent carbon space that will be swallowed up because of this inaction, which means that it will take away carbon space from people, not just countries, who need that space to grow. We have to ask ourselves, what is the point of pushing for 3x increase in renewables, something that I have myself worked very hard for, and something that India's G20 presidency very boldly put forward in the Green Development Pact the 3x increase in renewables, the doubling of energy efficiency. But what is the point of these targets if we are not counting climate finance? And we're not counting climate finance, we're not then counting clean energy investment. Points that I have made on CCAG briefings numerous times before, so nothing new that I'm repeating. But I think it's a sign of the world we've ended up creating, where we celebrate wordsmithing over action. And I'm not sure I'm ready to accept that anymore.
That's a very bleak response there, Arunabha, but we totally appreciate it, and it's great that you're keeping it real. I feel you've given the COP28 distinctly average grades. Let's go over to Professor Yi to hear your thoughts from the Chinese perspective.
Well, I'm not sure if it is I do not represent anybody, certainly not representing anyone from the government. I welcome that agreement, transitioning away from fossil fuel, but I am much less enthusiastic about this. I think this is something. This is so obvious, right? And I also agree with Johan that this is we're spending too much time on this wording, this phasing out, phasing down, and transitioning away. To me, is pretty much like a word game, and with very little real content, real substance there. And overall, I think this is a quite disappointing COP. And the thing is, we have different COPs. We always have the same kind of celebration. And each time, this time I'm particularly disappointed that, we have so many people who have gone there and then reached an agreement that was some people are called historic deal, and to me it is not historic at all. It's just so obvious. This is also realizing that the transitioning away from fossil fuel and also decarbonization. This is something that has been happening for a long time. Actually, if you analyze the carbon intensity of our energy system, almost every one of the major economies that they're doing the decarbonization. The last decade, that kind of decarbonization has accelerated. The last decade, we have seen this very rapid increase of wind, solar, electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. But the thing is, this COP and these negotiators, they do not really look at this overall trend, and they put down a roadmap and a real plan, and to actually build upon that. They are self-congratulating themselves, and they are trying very hard to make people believe this thing is actually working. In my view, I mean, I said this 6 years ago. I say this again, that I think the overall this thing reflects the overall failure of our global climate governance. I think this UN-led, this is an elitist approach to climate governance, really need to be reconsidered and have some major change. Otherwise, we're not really addressing the real problem. We're not even looking at the real reality here. We're just feel good about ourselves, and this should not go on forever.
Powerful words from our three CCAG experts there, and I feel it seems like it's time that we start to reevaluate what COP28 is about, and try to find a new way for world governance on this issue, because it's so urgent. It's so urgent. Fatima, please go ahead.
Yeah. No, just to bounce off some of what was said by Johan, Arunabha, and others. I think, yes, as Johan said, the semantic side of things, I mean, the phase out, the phase down, or the transition away can be seen as prepositions, more or less. But the challenge is the prepositions for some people, and they translate into real collateral damage, hardship, I'd say, for others. So to me, the language is indicative of the power dynamics and the fact that the climate negotiation is a symbol of power. And has been for a long time, actually, because these words are basically, I'd say, words that people have maybe reflected on. But as I said before, it's almost like a luxury of time. There are people who have gotten that time and who can then now talk about transition away. But that transition away, means, as I said before, real struggle and real hardship for most people, especially those that are in the front line in terms of climate impacts, because those are people who have difficulties recovering from soil degradation, from slow onsets, which in turn produces droughts and floods. Broken supply chains, food systems, all of that lot, But the other point is the every delay in terms of transition away or phase out or phase down is a delay in climate justice as well. Because the climate injustice is so seeped into the negotiation process that we're talking about transition. But I mean, for me, transition is your incremental steps. What countries in the global south need is more than just incremental steps. In fact, they don't have legacy emissions. So to talk about transition in that context is a bit of a misnomer. These countries need real transformation, because it's a system change. The climate finance architecture in itself needs to change, So the changes are deep, profound. They're not changes on the margins, countries in the global north, because these are mature economies, they have made some start in terms of that transition. They have to now look at how they customize their systems to reduce emissions. But countries in the global in the global south have not even started. They don't even have access. So how can you then transition when access in itself is not in place? So I think these for me are some of the real difficulties. And I think we should also focus on a word which seems to be lost in the narrative, which is resilience. Because the countries in the global south really do need resilience. I mean, everybody does need resilience. It's not a monopoly of global south or global north. But it's particularly important for the global south because it can enable them to recover from all these disruptive experiences, to be able to prepare. That preparation that Johan talked about, the plan, how you can become better equipped in terms of mitigating these stresses. But we need more than just a plan. We need a strategy. We need a contingency plan also. We need to be able to cost how much this is going to cost us. We need budgets. We need to put required resources in place. We're talking about transitioning away, and we're also talking about critical minerals. Are we going to reproduce some of the past injustices that we've seen with critical minerals, particularly because these are going to come from the global south? So the governance and institutional architecture that must accompany these processes have been hardly talked about. We are so fixated on carbon because that's the problem. It is a big problem, but we are not talking about some of the difficulties that the countries in the global south are facing and how they can then become, I would say, more able to prepare for the disruptions that they're likely and they continue to face.
Dr. Fatima Denton, thank you for that really important intervention. And I think the first 20 minutes of this live stream has probably encapsulated why I feel what CCAG do is so important. We've been given perspectives from all over the world there, from Africa, from India, from China, from Europe, on COP28, but what needs to be done if we're to take on this climate crisis. It's an emergency. And what we have here is knowledge, the knowledge of some really important people. And I think if you're out there, share this live stream, share what CCAG do to your friends and your family, because it is so important. The best way that we can deal with this climate crisis is through knowledge and turning that knowledge into action. So once again, thank you to our experts. We're going to move on now and start with our first guest, who's been eagerly waiting. Thank you for your patience, Tom Evans, Policy Advisor on the Climate Diplomacy Team at E3G. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about any of the observations you have from COP28? Maybe give us a grade as well, and then let us know your question for our CCAG experts.
Sure, yeah. Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. It's a really interesting discussion. It's good to hear these kind of different views on where the success and where the failure of COP28 might lie. I think my own perspective is that it's definitely a bit of a mixed bag. It's not something that it's not been a resounding success, but I don't think it's been an outright failure either. I think listening to that conversation just now makes me reflect a lot on kind of what the purpose of the COP is and what the aims of the UNFCCC system are. And I think we could have a long debate about that. But for me, trying to see it as a space which is the universal shared climate convening forum. So inevitably it does have everyone at the table. That has huge benefits. It means we hear from the small island states. It means we hear from those climate vulnerable countries who are, fighting for their existence. But it also means we have the big players, big emitters at the table too, and that's always the tension. And I think even though it does often produce kind of low or lowest common denominator outcomes, it also still provides a way to kind of mark that shared baseline of where we're going. And so it's slow, but I think it's still important that as all countries of the world, they've managed to agree something like transitioning away from fossil fuels, which obviously is not enough. It's obviously a weak signal compared to what we wanted in terms of a strong call for phase out of fossil fuels, in terms of this plan, as others have said, of actually making that transition happen with finance underpinning it. But still, I think for kind of marking that signal and laying out that territory, I think that's really important. I think it's interesting. The beginning of the COP began with that agreement on the loss and damage fund, which again I think shows the strength of the UNFCCC system. It's much too late. It's been something that, again, the climate vulnerable countries have wanted for many years. But it's hard to imagine a scenario where that would have been agreed outside of the UNFCCC, where I can't imagine a scenario where, say, the G7 or the G20 would have managed to reach that agreement of their own accord. It's something that the multilateral system can bring forward together, and actually that's where the trust and the relationship building and the foundations for cooperation can start, even though there's still much work ahead to take that loss and damage fund and make it something that's actually adequately capitalized, that actually delivers billions of finance to where it needs to go. Again, I think the UNFCCC system has shown there is value in that multilateral process. And so we have to live with those tensions and awkwardness. And I think maybe finally, listening to all the other panelists, I very much agree that the finance question is where really the focus now needs to shift. The finance, it will be is the key missing ingredient to unlocking this plan to actually deliver the transition away from fossil fuels, to deliver the tripling of renewables by 2030, to actually build the resilience and actually prepare developing countries for the impacts of climate change, which was a huge issue at COP28. It really kind of became one of the central focuses, adaptation and how we deal with adaptation finance. And I think that for me is where we now really need to focus our efforts at that multilateral level of how can we build functioning systems, reforming the financial architecture, putting pressure on developed countries on actually raising climate finance, and all of those ingredients coming together to unlock something that would actually be functional and lead to real emissions reductions and resilience building in developing countries. And I think, for me, the question which we've already maybe addressed, it is that question of, is the agreement from COP28 something that shows a functional Paris Agreement and shows that we're slowly moving towards delivering on that vision? Or is it reflective of the fact that the system is not functioning, and what do we need to do to make the Paris Agreement actually work? And how do we live into those commitments that we've made and take them from the page of a COP text and translate that into real action on the ground? I'll leave it there,
Tom,
but look forward to hearing people's responses.
Great question, Tom. Great question. And thank you for those reflections. Really important. I'm going to pass this on to Professor Johan Rockström first, and, how do we make the Paris agreements work? How do we make a functional economic system that's going to work and help countries transition into a more sustainable future?
I think in a way it's been captured partly by Xi and Fatima and Arunabha, but also in this final point here by Tom, that it's not in the semantics or in the negotiated text. It is in how we achieve in the implementation. And the implementation goes down to justice, and it goes down to accountability, and it goes down to finance. And I say this because of the urgency. We all agree, it's even in the Dubai text, that we need to cut global emissions by half within the next 7 years across all fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. That's 6 to 7% reductions per year. That is roughly the same pace that we shockingly experienced for half a year during the pandemic, all for the wrong reasons, shutting down the global economy, which will not take us towards the equitable outcome we need. So we need to put accountability, finance, and equity up front. And for example, that requires some big decisions. And that's what I think needs to come out of this. I think we don't have an excuse based on the text that has been agreed to take decisions such as, one, to start phasing out the subsidies to fossil fuels, the $7 trillion per year in subsidies. Number two, to put a moratorium on all new investments in fossil fuel infrastructure. Very easy decisions, entirely in line with the Dubai Agreement. It's actually violating the Dubai Agreement to do what Norway and to do what UAE have announced to do even post-Dubai. It's violating the Dubai framework. We also need a third decision, which is to vastly scale up the investments in helping developing countries to phase over, transition away, which we've now agreed on, from coal to renewable energy. This can only be done given that countries own their state coal infrastructure in state-owned, often run-down infrastructure, to basically have new mechanisms that the IMF and World Bank can step in to invest and take over the ownership of this infrastructure and help nations to have a kilowatt hour per kilowatt hour transition to enable an orderly phase out. These kind of out-of-the-box ideas must now come forth. A global price on carbon. The CBAM in the European Union is now being implemented. That will lead to 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide price on carbon in the world's largest economic region. We're talking about in the next 2 years. That has to be copied and pasted in different markets around the world. I mean, not pasted one-to-one, but have equivalent type of economic incentives to push all financial flows away from investments in fossil fuels. So what I'm saying is that it's the downstream implementation that really matters. At least that's what I would argue.
Thank you, Professor Rockström. I'd like to ask if any of our other CCAG members would like to add anything to this. But I'd also specifically actually want to ask Dr. Arunabha, going on your quite scathing comments about COP28 and connecting that to what Professor Rockström has just said about implementation. How would you go about making things right, making things work? What are the things that COP28 are doing wrong, and how would you change that to make the implementation work?
I think we have discussed some of this, Ade, during these briefings, CCAG briefings, and Johan has referred to this as well today, as of other CCAG members in previous calls. I think for any implementation, you need a plan of action. You don't need just a target. And of course, we recognize that the plan of action will vary from country to country, depending on where they are situated, as long as overall we are adhering to the science.
Dr. can I just chime in there as well quickly? What you pointed out is very important. The plan of action will change and vary from countries. But one of the other problems is different countries have different motivations because they're on different timescales. And that, I feel, is where the disconnect comes. It seems like the Global South, they feel, well, it's more urgent for them because it's immediate, it's happening right now. But from what I see from some members in the Global North, it feels like they see it as a slower transition and not so beneficial to make this implementation. So how do we make these two worlds meet?
I don't think it's just a Global North versus Global South issue either. In large part, it is because of the lack of investment flows into the regions where energy infrastructure is needed. But there are different aspects of the Global South and different aspects of the Global North where economic structures and the domestic political economies vary. What I had in a report I had published before Glasgow, I had shown that 88% of the electricity demand over the next 2 decades will come from developing countries and emerging markets, but that over 60% of them, not counting China, were already demonstrating a peaking or plateauing in their use of fossil fuels to generate electricity. But they were not attracting the investment. So the point I'm trying to make here is we need a plan. We can't wish away a Global South or a Global North economy that is dependent on fossil fuels. But nor can we wish away a Global South economy that needs energy in the first place. But the answers will be different. The 1 hour we spent on this briefing, CCAG briefing, 11,500 additional human beings should have got access to electricity. And every hour, 11,500 human beings have to get access to electricity for the remainder of this decade to meet SDG 7. So the decision at the margin is, will that human being get access to electricity first of all? Is it a yes or a no? And if it is a yes, will that electron be a clean electron or no? So we cannot simply say, let's have ambitions for clean electrons, but not have ambitions for electrons in the first place. And secondly, we can't have ambitions just for clean electrons without saying, where's the clean money to finance that clean electron? So we really need to get real about implementation, plans, roadmaps, but the hard nuts and bolts of money, manpower, materials, supply chains, the time it takes to tender out a project, time it takes to build, time it takes to build out a grid extension to connect the renewable energy plant to the household, the time it takes to build a pump storage plant or a battery storage plant. These are the nuts and bolts that, unfortunately, the obsession with just setting targets and then wordsmithing around those targets diverts our attention away from these harder but real on-the-ground issues that we have to solve. And therefore, I think the COPs, to answer your question, have to be interspersed. And this is something that Johan and I and others wrote a few months ago in a letter to the UN Secretary General and to the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, that we've got to not just have COPs around, these mega convenings, but how do we have more frequent interactions where we're looking at the implementation challenges and removing the bottlenecks for those implementation challenges so that we can then come back and raise ambitions when we have the confidence that we've delivered what we promised.
Thank you, Dr. Arunabha. Yeah, it feels like it is. We need huge change, but we have little time, and we have to actually acquire a lot of resilience to move this on. But I think you make a good point about having more frequent COPs. Tom Evans, thank you so much for your question and kicking us off. We may have time to come back to you a little bit later on in the session. Let's see, but let's turn to Dr. Jennifer Allan from Cardiff University School of Law and Politics. Dr. Allan, first of all, welcome. And can we get your feelings around COP28? Everyone else has given their point of view. It'd be nice to hear what your thoughts are. And then could you also give us your question as well, please?
Sorry. Yes, thanks for having me. So a lot of what I'm interested in my academic work, also in my sort of practical role at COP, so this was just my 11th COP. I'm a little bit still in recovery mode, I think, looks at how we see civil society has changed rapidly. They've diversified. We now talk about feminist climate politics, words that we use all the time, like climate justice, just transition. A lot of that came from social movements that then decided that they also wanted to work on climate. So we've seen a lot of change in that space. But then a lot of my work has shown that we see remarkable continuity in the negotiation space. So the idea that action and implementation is nationally determined goes way back to the Kyoto Protocol even. Those targets that were written into the treaty, they were written on pieces of paper in the final nights of the negotiations and walked up to the front of the dais for someone to enter into a computer. They weren't sort of these negotiated targets like we often think. And that's what we're still in that world. And some of my work has also shown that we don't talk about mitigation all that much. So there's been a lot of agenda items about reducing emissions. Most of those have been about forests and have been about market mechanisms. So in that way, COP28 is interesting because it does sketch out, and I wouldn't say it's a fully realized package, but it sketches out some of the aspects of an energy transition. But something else that I think Dr. Denton spoke to far more eloquently than I will is that adaptation, building resilience and reducing vulnerabilities to climate change always is sort of this leftover issue that nobody pays attention to. And COP28 showed us that as well. So while 700 million was pledged to the Loss and Damage Fund, the Adaptation Fund raised 155 million. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on this energy transition, and we're putting a lot of initial emphasis and happy about this Loss and Damage Fund and starting to get that off the ground. But in between this adaptation space, if we ignore that, then we're basically guaranteeing that we're in this permanent effects of loss and damage space. So there's been a lot of continuities at COP, which I think are really difficult and kind of speak to the power dynamics that we always see replay over and over and over. One thing I'll also say, since I was there in the last closing plenary, is a delegate from Marshall Islands was crying at the back of the room because AOSIS, the small island states, they weren't in the room when that decision was gavelled and taken. And for them, as many of the other speakers have said, this doesn't guarantee their survival. And so there was a lot of emotion about this. We talk about negotiations as these legal, institutional, wordsmithing spaces, and of course they're all of that. But they are also human spaces where people have to live with and go home and explain to everyone around them in their communities, what did they do and what do these outcomes mean for them? So I think that's something that I took home from COP28, even perhaps more than usual. But anyways, sorry, my question is, what is sort of an overlooked detail? Because we've really focused on this energy transition bit, but what for you is an overlooked detail out of the COP28 package of decisions that you think really should get some more attention?
Great question, and thank you for those reflections, Jennifer. Perhaps Dr. Fatima Denton, you could take this one on. Do you think there are overlooked details from COP28, something that we've missed out? Oh, you're on mute, Fatima. Hello?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, I think for me, Jennifer has, Dr. Allan, I should say, has already provided some of those responses in her initial observation of what's happening. I mean, the residual, or at least even I'd say the stubborn issue here, is that very little attention is still given to adaptation. But still, when you talk about the adaptation goal, closing the gap on adaptation finance, the text is really weak. It continues to be weak. The institutions, I mean, and again, as Arunabha said, this is not just about goals and targets. It's about almost like the scaffolding that holds it together, the institutions that hold it together, the people that hold it together. You know, those are the things that are invisible in this conversation. And for me is the research aspect as well. There is a tremendous amount of research that's taking place, but very often, you know, you don't get to see it in the sort of global mix of what's been done. And sometimes it's even considered as grey literature, you know, euphemistically called grey literature. So I would say the transformation or even transition that we see cannot be done without a massive investment in adaptation research. There's a tremendous amount of adaptation research that's taking place, but the last IPCC report suggested that, you know, not enough is being invested in adaptation research. And the other problem is that there are fragile countries. I mean, one of the things that I see also missing is that we're not talking enough about a precondition that would enable adaptation and mitigation. For me, is security, it's peace. We're not talking enough about that. There is vulnerability of fragile states, you know, that have been fragile for a long time, and that are facing problems related to governance, disruptions and dysfunctions, etc. But that fragility in itself exacerbating, and it's you know, it's adding to the other climate stresses that we see. And those things are intangible. They don't get seen in the wider sort of lens or radar when we come to discussing these issues. So I would want to say how we support adaptation, like real support in terms of, you know, we're talking about the nationally determined contributions, for instance. There are so many lessons that we could learn from the former national determined contributions to the new suite of national NDCs in terms of, you know, what are some of the things that we need to do differently? I agree that we've put some monies now into a loss and damage fund, but for me, the problem is not just throwing monies at the loss and damage fund. The problem is looking at the financial architecture of these funds. It's understanding the operational effectiveness of these funds. Is making sure that those that need the funds understand how they can navigate this labyrinth very often, where you have to almost like queue at every, you know, every counter to be able to get something, so that you can then use those funds to be able to make good on your adaptation plans. It's almost like a punishment, a double, triple to punishment. The countries have already been through all of this rigmarole of different impacts, and now have to start queuing out, getting their systems in order, talking to the big financial institution who've got very stringent measures to be able to pass through that, Arunabha was talking about passing and grades. I mean, it's a real exam. They really have to go through all these different bureaucratic structures, you know, to be able to be seen as credible institution that could then be given the support that they need. So I would say for me, there are the few things I would say are not seen through the big microscopic lens of the COP negotiations. For me, is still the way we look at adaptation. Adaptation is still the cousin of the response mechanisms. You know, it's still how we look at research that would enable us to really go from where we are now to the big transformation changes that we need. We're talking about minerals, critical minerals that will support the transition, and it means that we might have to mine more, but we are not putting in place the relevant research that would enable us to say, okay, how much is this going to leave our ecosystems intact? You know, how is this going to change things? You know, and so many other things that have been left out of the conversation because of the fact that the emphasis and the focus is around targets, around making sure that we stay within the temperature guardrail. So the short answer to Jennifer's question is the market mechanisms have got their flaws, their imperfections. We're leaving out a lot of the political economy big questions that we're not asking ourselves. Adaptation funding is still not been given sufficient momentum and support. The investment is flowing very slowly into these, into adaptation. And we're not talking enough about fragility and the drivers of fragility, especially when it comes to countries, you know, that are going to experience, you know, another second loot, I would say, because their resources will be had. They will not have a lot of say in terms of, you know, ownership of these resources. Big multinational companies will come and decide for them. You know, those are, to me, are the things that are left unsaid, and that we need to really get, you know, we need to get a grip on. We can't transition to just to, you know, I mean, people are talking about acceleration. How do you accelerate if you're going in the wrong direction? You know, we need to know accelerating, yes, but how? You know, what's our direction of travel? And how do we not reproduce some of these past harms and wrongs that we have created in the past?
Thank you, Dr. Fatima Denton. I'm conscious of time and we still have one more guest to get in. I just quickly, and I'm cognizant of people who are new to the live stream, and we also want to demystify a lot of the language. But Dr. Allan, could you quickly, very quickly, just sum up what you mean and what we mean by adaptations?
I'll give it a go. Interestingly, this is also just to say how little we spend time on it. There isn't a totally agreed UNFCCC definition of adaptation. But when we think about it, we could think about it as planning ahead, using climate information to say what's going to happen in the future, what sort of effects might we see, and then how can we build resilience or reduce our vulnerability to those planned effects. So I'm in Cardiff. Cardiff is built by the sea, and it's a very vulnerable city to sea level rise. And so the city is looking ahead in terms of how can we build resilience to the sea level rise we're going to see and make sure that we have adequate drainage is one quick example.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Allan, and thank you for your contribution. Let's move swiftly on to our final guest. It's Ade Adepitan. Shay, first of all, I know you've been waiting for a while, so thank you for that. And let's know your thoughts on COP28, and could you also give us your question as well, please?
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. And it's good to be in the same virtual space with people whose work I respect and I've been following for a while right now. COP28 was, I mean, we've heard a little bit from, you know, both the positive and negative. For me, I should say started on a very positive note, given that I have been part of the loss and damage negotiation since COP25 in Madrid and went into Glasgow. And we thought, you know, last year, even though it was 39 hours after the official closing, we had like a package. But it started, you know, on a very positive note, like, yes, we're going to adopt this. We're going to operationalize this loss and damage funds. And in the first day alone, there was 100 million, and then another 100 from UAE and Germany. And I thought, okay, let's see how far this goes. But in the end, we saw that everything that got the loss and damage fund got was really, really tiny compared to the I think the 83 billion funds that was pledged during this meeting. Loss and damage got far less than 800 million US dollars. And that tells you again and again that as much as we could celebrate the fact that, yes, this was agreed upon, this was, a very positive momentum on which we started, it still begs the question of how much priority is the loss and damage framework for international meetings like this. And this is why, on my own part also, like many of the speakers have said, I do question the fact that the UN system as it is right now is the most authentic way for us to go. I think there's a lot of improvement that we need if we really must get serious about these global climate policies that we're working around. But then, that said, I think my question will be particularly linked to a point that Dr. Denton mentioned earlier. And it's around Article 28A of this UAE consensus, as we know it, that talks about how by 2030, we're going to triple our renewable energy. And I'm thinking about how many of these, mineral resources, rare earth metals comes from Africa, and what exactly will the tripled, renewable energy mean for places where these materials are being sourced? Will it equal like triple times the hardship and the human rights issues surrounding how these materials are being unearthed? Are we going to stand the risk of experiencing the same challenges that we've seen with the way fossil fuel has been extracted? Or will it, on the other hand, mean that the people in these communities have 3 times chance of developing, of becoming even better? This is something that I've been thinking about, and I would love to get reflections from some of the CCAG members around what exactly will the 3 times renewable energy by 2030 mean for the people on the ground, the places where these materials will come from, so we do not repeat the mistake with the fossil fuel extraction systems.
Shay, what a great question and what a great contribution as well. We haven't got much time, but I want to quickly get some thoughts from all of our CCAG experts. I'm going to start off with you, Dr. Fatima Denton. We'll move into a renewable future. Will that lead to more exploitation of Africa, or is this a potential opportunity for a positive future for Africa? Or can we have your mic?
Yes, sorry. I don't seem to have the reflex of unmuting myself. Yes, I think largely it can be an opportunity because, this is also the continent where you have over 600, million people that do not have access to clean cooking. And so the modern energy systems that we need are not in place. So that in itself is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for markets, for investments, entrepreneurs could also make something really big out of this. So I would say that in that context, it's not all doom and gloom. We often tend to look at the negative, but I think that given that Africa has this huge market, even in terms of its population of, potentially 2.5 billion, that's a sizable market opportunity there. It's an opportunity also for our supply chains as well. We're often talking and lamenting about the broken supply chains. We're a continent that tend to import food, even though we have 60% of the world's arable land, but we do import food of over 100 billion, annually. In terms of dollars, and that could also help us solve that problem of broken supply chains as well. Where I think it, and from a trade perspective, we don't often connect climate change and trade, but the African Continental Free Trade Area as well is the largest trading bloc. That could mean trillions of a trillion-size economy for the size of the continent and some of the goods that we're talking about. But what I think we don't often talk about is, these things cannot happen without a governance structure. I think Johan mentioned governance. We need that sort of institutional hardware to really support the process. Without that, it's going to be very random, very spontaneous, and also to make the point that it's also the continent that, where, we suffer from illicit financial flow. A lot of this, is salted away, over $80 billion, gets lost in terms of capital flight. And so those governance systems are also very important to have in place. So as I said before, we don't want to be reproducing some of these past mistakes that we've seen in the past. So that, I think, is a problem. But I think there's also a problem of ownership. These new minerals that we're talking about, they're actually not new, but let's say they're critical. These critical minerals that we're talking about often would mean that, private companies would have to come and put a huge amount of money on the table. And then countries like Ghana, this is a debate that's going on even here in terms of lithium. Are you going to now start? Government of Ghana would have to start collecting royalties, and the discussion is, are you collecting royalties over goods that you own? And when the money is in terms of equity is put on the table, this is a huge amount of money to put on the table, which the host country cannot match. And so there is an issue then of being further indebted to another foreign country or multinationals that come. And therefore, you have to now start questioning the control of these resources. And there's all the other problems around fragility, as I mentioned, with human rights abuse. The DRC is often cited with cobalt, etc. Child labor, all of those things are the ugly side of what we would like to see. So I think it would be good to see how we rise up to the opportunity, and how we basically make space to address some of the structural problems that are there, which are not going to go away. I would say where the support is needed is to help Africa scale up its renewable energy potential, to help Africa also in terms of the design it has for a green industrialization. Because if it's able to do that, it could show the rest of the world a business model of how this could work. Because it might probably even be the first continent that makes a success of doing that. But it means that those investment flows have to match ambition. And right now, that's where the major problems are. We're talking about this as a potential, but we're not necessarily feeding it with the feedstock that it needs, which is monies, and investment flows and markets, because Africa is often seen perceptually as a continent that is, not worthy of these investments because of the risks that are associated with the continent. So yes, an opportunity, but depending on how we manage this, I would say a new paradigm shift is needed, where we look at how we can make good on some of the problems related to governance, related to investment and markets, so that we're not just, reinforcing these structural difficulties and past wrongs.
Dr. Fatima Denton, thank you so much for that. Professor Rockström, could we have just some final thoughts from you on today's session, including that final question?
Yes, thanks. Well, undoubtedly, I think what this session shows and confirms, and I think it also confirms a feeling that was in the air also in the final session in plenary in Dubai, that even though we finally now, almost 10 years behind schedule after the Paris Agreement, start to get a plan of phase out of fossil fuels, there's so much remaining to do, and that the COP meetings is not, let's say, the problem-solving arena, that there's so much that needs to be done outside of these consensus-based large gatherings. I think that is one. But secondly, on trebling renewable energy systems, I think that is a significant step, and I think there's a serious commitment to that from the big development banks and financial institutions. But that won't be enough. We know that so far the exponential rise in renewable energy is not pushing away oil, coal, and gas. On the contrary, it's only meeting growing demand. And this has to be also handled in an equitable way, particularly in the global south. How do you enable a real transition while securing economic development? I mean, that will be the big challenge. And I think that brings back to Boxi's and Fatima's and Arunabha's points. So there's no doubt in my mind that we're still on a journey of massive efforts required to hold the science, but also the speed and equity fundamentally up front when we act as we move forward.
Thank you, Professor Rockström. It's been an enlightening session, and I just want to thank all our guests, especially Shayi for that final question as well. Look, before we finish today's session, I'd like to personally thank all of our CCAG experts and everyone involved in producing our monthly meetings. It's been a tough year, but I think maintaining hope is incredibly important, and when it comes to dealing with the climate crisis. And that's what these meetings give me. And I hope it gives you at home, everyone watching, the same thing. I hope it gives you the knowledge and the empowerment that we need in order to deal with this climate crisis. So thank you to all of you around the world for watching and supporting what we do. We'll keep using what I think are our greatest assets, which are the science, the knowledge of our experts, and the power of media to get the knowledge out there. And most importantly, your stories, the stories of people being directly impacted by climate change right now. So thanks from the Climate Advisory Group to every single person who has joined us this year, whether that's a guest of our panel of experts or those of you tuning in at home. We wish you a very, very lovely and safe Christmas, and we look forward to seeing you in the next year. Bye-bye.